Imagine a soldier in a war-torn desert, scribbling letters to his grandmother with one unshakable vow, to make it home for her 90th birthday. Private Ethan Ramsey pours his heart into every word, but when an ambush silences his pen, his promise hangs in the balance. In a small Tennessee town, Ruth Ramsey waits, clinging to his last note, until a stranger arrives with a letter that changes everything. The late spring sun dipped low over the rolling hills of Riverton, Tennessee, painting the sky in streaks of orange and pink as it sank behind the old oak trees lining Grandma Ruth Ramsey's farmhouse. The air carried the sweet scent of blooming honeysuckle, a gentle breeze rustling the faded curtains that framed her kitchen window. Inside, the small house hummed with the quiet rhythm of a life well lived, creaking floorboards, a kettle simmering on the stove, and the soft patter of Rusty, her scruffy terrier trotting across the linoleum. Ruth sat at the worn oak table, her 89-year-old hands trembling slightly as she unfolded a letter, its edges crinkled from a long journey across continents. The handwriting was unmistakable, bold, looping, a little messy, belonging to her grandson, Private Ethan Ramsey. She adjusted her glasses, the wireframe slipping down her nose, and cleared her throat, her voice raspy but warm as she began to read aloud. "Dear Grandma," she started, glancing at Rusty, who tilted his head as if listening. "It's hot as blazes out here, and the sand gets everywhere. Boots, socks, even my toothbrush. You'd hate it." A faint smile tugged at her lips, her gray eyes crinkling at the corners. Ethan's letters came every week, a lifeline from his base in Afghanistan to this quiet corner of Tennessee, each one a thread tying her to the boy she'd raised after his parents died in a car wreck when he was 10. "But don't worry," she continued, her voice steadying. "I'm keeping my head down just like you taught me. 6 months from now I'll be home for your 90th birthday, cake and all, promise." Ruth paused, her fingers tracing the word promise, the ink smudged where Ethan's pen had pressed harder, as if sealing it with his will. She could picture him, 22, lanky, with her late husband's hazel eyes and a grin that lit up a room, hunched over a cot in some dusty tent, scribbling under a flickering bulb. He'd enlisted 2 years ago, driven by a quiet resolve to honor his parents, to make something of himself beyond Riverton's sleepy fields. She'd cried the day he left, hiding her tears behind a fierce hug, but his letters kept her going. Weekly bursts of humor and heart that made the distance bearable. "Rusty, he's coming home," she said, her voice lifting as she scratched the dog's ears. "Cake and all, probably that chocolate one with the pecans he loves." Rusty wagged his tail, a soft thump against the floor, and Ruth chuckled, the sound echoing in the small kitchen. The farmhouse was a time capsule of their life together. Photos of Ethan's high school football games on the fridge, a quilt she'd sewn for his 16th birthday draped over the couch, his old guitar still propped in the corner, gathering dust. Every corner held a memory, and now, with his promise in her hands, it held a future too. She rose, her knees creaking as she shuffled to the counter, setting the letter beside a stack of others tied with a red ribbon. The kettle whistled, and she poured hot water into a chipped mug, the steam curling up to fog her glasses. As she stirred in a spoonful of honey, the TV in the living room flickered to life. She'd left it on, a habit to fill the silence since Ethan shipped out. The news anchor's voice drifted in, clipped and serious. Tensions escalate in Afghanistan as insurgent attacks target U.S. bases. Casualties reported in the eastern provinces. Ruth's hand froze mid-stir, the spoon clattering against the mug's rim. She turned, her heart thudding, and shuffled to the doorway, peering at the screen. Grainy footage showed plumes of smoke rising from a desert outpost, soldiers in fatigues scrambling amid chaos. The anchor's words blurred into static. Ongoing conflict, search operations. And Ruth gripped the doorframe, her knuckles whitening. "Not my Ethan," she whispered, her voice barely audible over Rusty's sudden whine. She forced herself to breathe, shaking her head as if to banish the images. "He's fine," he promised. She turned off the TV with a trembling hand, the silence rushing back, heavier now, tinged with a flicker of dread she couldn't shake. Returning to the table, she picked up the letter again, rereading the final lines. "Tell Mrs. Clara I'll fix her fence when I'm back. She's been nagging you about it, I bet. And save me a dance at your party, Grandma. Love, Ethan." Ruth smiled, though her eyes glistened with unshed tears. Mrs. Clara, her neighbor down the lane, had indeed been grumbling about that rickety fence, and Ethan's teasing tone was as clear as if he were sitting across from her, sipping sweet tea. She pressed the letter to her chest, the paper crinkling against her sweater, and closed her eyes. 6 months, she murmured. You'll be here, cake and all. The kitchen clock ticked steadily, marking the slow crawl of another day without him. Ruth set the letter down, smoothing it flat, and reached for a pen and notepad from the drawer. Dear Ethan, she wrote, her handwriting wobbly but determined. Your letter came today, and Rusty and I loved every word. I'm counting the days till your promise comes true. She paused, glancing at the dark TV, the news report's shadow lingering in her mind. She pushed it aside, focusing on the warmth of his words, the certainty of his return. This was their ritual, his letters to her, hers to him, a tether across the miles, unbreakable, she told herself. Outside, the crickets began their evening chorus, a familiar sound that usually soothed her. Tonight it felt distant, drowned by the faint hum of worry she couldn't silence. Ruth folded her reply, tucking it into an envelope, and set it beside the stack, ready for Monday's mail. She stood leaning on her cane and shuffled to the window, peering at the stars peeking through the twilight. You promised, Ethan, she whispered, her breath fogging the glass. And I'm holding you to it. The promise held her steady, for now it was enough to keep the darkness at bay. The summer sun blazed over Riverton, Tennessee, turning the fields around Ruth Ramsey's farmhouse into a shimmering sea of green and gold. It was late July, 3 months since Ethan's last letter had arrived, and the air hung heavy with humidity, the kind that stuck to the skin and made every breath feel like a chore. Ruth stood by the mailbox at the end of her gravel driveway, her cane sinking slightly into the soft earth, her gray eyes fixed on the rusted metal box as if staring could summon the postman early. Rusty sat at her feet, his tongue lolling, his scruffy fur matted with dust from their daily trek. The cicadas buzzed in the trees, a relentless drone that filled the silence she'd come to dread. She lifted the mailbox lid with a trembling hand, her heart sinking as she peered inside. Nothing but a grocery flyer and a bill from the electric company. Not today, Rusty, she murmured, her voice cracking as she shut the lid with a soft clang. The dog tilted his head, whining softly, and she patted him absently, her gaze drifting to the horizon where the mail truck usually appeared. For weeks, she'd waited like this, each empty day chipping away at the hope she'd clung to since Ethan's promise. I'll be home for your 90th, cake and all. 3 months ago, that letter had been her anchor. Now its absence was a weight pulling her under. Ruth shuffled back to the porch, her cane tapping a slow rhythm, and sank into the rocking chair she'd shared with Ethan on countless summer evenings. Her mind drifted to those days. Him at 15, sprawled across the steps with a glass of her sweet tea, laughing as she recounted tales of her youth. Grandma, you should have been a writer, he'd say, his hazel eyes, so like his grandfather's, sparkling with mischief. She'd raised him after the crash that took his parents, a quiet boy who'd grown into a man with a heart too big for Riverton's small borders. He'd enlisted at 20, telling her over supper one night, I want to make them proud, Grandma, Mom and Dad, and you. She'd nodded, hiding her fear behind a smile, knowing he'd already made her prouder than words could hold. The screen door creaked, and Mrs. Clara stepped out from the kitchen, wiping her hands on a faded apron. Still nothing? She asked, her voice gentle but tinged with worry. Ruth's neighbor had taken to dropping by most afternoons, her presence a quiet comfort since the letters stopped. Ruth shook her head, her fingers twisting the hem of her sweater. Not a word, Clara. It's been 12 weeks. I counted. Clara settled onto the porch swing, her silver hair catching the sunlight. He's busy, Ruth. You know how it gets over there. Mail's slow, that's all. Ruth forced a smile, but it didn't reach her eyes. He promised, Clara. Every week, like clockwork. Something's wrong, I feel it. Clara reached over, squeezing her hand. He's a Ramsey, stubborn as you. He'll come through. Ruth nodded, wanting to believe it, but the memory of that news report from spring gnawed at her. The smoke, the chaos, the eastern provinces where Ethan's base sat. She'd turned off the TV after that, refusing to watch, but the silence from Afghanistan spoke louder than any broadcast. She pulled Ethan's last letter from her pocket, the paper worn thin from rereading, and traced his words. Tell Mrs. Clara I'll fix her fence when I'm back. Clara chuckled softly. That boy, always teasing me about that fence. Across the ocean, in a dusty outpost under a relentless sun, Ethan had scribbled that letter, his squad mate Private Sam Carter ribbing him from a nearby cot. Another one for Grandma? Sam had grinned, his freckled face streaked with sweat. Ethan smirked, his pen scratching the page. Every week, man. Keeps her going, and me too. Sam leaned over, peering at the words. What's this about a birthday? Her 90th, Ethan said, his voice softening. Gonna be there, cake and all. Promised her. Sam clapped his shoulder, laughing. Better bring me some too, Ramsey. Ethan's hazel eyes glinted with determination as he sealed the envelope, the desert wind howling outside, a promise he meant to keep. Back in Riverton, the memory faded as Ruth folded the letter, her hands shaking more now than they had in May. The TV stayed off, but whispers from town crept in. Mrs. Clara's son at the feed store mentioning troop movements, a cousin's friend in Knoxville hearing about casualties. Ruth brushed them aside, clinging to Ethan's words, but doubt seeped through the cracks. That afternoon, the phone rang, its shrill tone slicing through the farmhouse's quiet. She hobbled to the kitchen, her pulse racing as she lifted the receiver. Mrs. Ramsey, a clipped voice said, an Army liaison. We regret to inform you Private Ethan Ramsey's unit was engaged in combat. He's currently listed as missing in action. The room spun, the phone slipping from her hand to dangle by its cord. Rusty barked, nudging her leg as she sank into a chair, her breath shallow. Missing, she whispered, the word a jagged edge in her throat. Clara rushed in, her face paling as she caught Ruth's expression. What is it? Ruth clutched the letter, her voice breaking. He's missing, Clara. My Ethan. He promised he'd come home. Tears spilled down her weathered cheeks, soaking the paper she held like a lifeline. Clara knelt beside her, wrapping her in a fierce hug. He's out there, Ruth. He's fighting to keep that promise. I know it. Ruth nodded, her sobs quieting into a trembling resolve. She pressed the letter to her chest, its smudged ink a tether to the boy she refused to lose. You promised, she whispered, her voice steadying with each word, and I'm holding you to it. Outside, the sun dipped below the hills, casting long shadows over the farmhouse, the silence stretching deeper now, a void she'd fill with faith until Ethan's voice returned. The Afghan desert stretched endless and unforgiving under a midday sun, its heat shimmering off the cracked earth like a mirage. Dust stung Private Sam Carter's eyes as he crouched behind a shattered wall, his uniform torn and blood-stained, the remnants of an ambush that had torn through his unit 2 days ago. At 24, Sam was wiry and freckled, his face hardened by months of combat, but his blue eyes burned with a desperate focus. Around him, the outpost lay in ruins, tents shredded, gear scattered, the air thick with the acrid smell of smoke and gunpowder. He clutched his rifle, his breath ragged, but his mind wasn't on the insurgents who'd fled. It was on Ethan Ramsey, his squad mate, his friend, missing since the attack. Sam replayed Ethan's last words, shouted over the roar of gunfire as they'd scrambled for cover. Get my letters to Grandma if I don't make it. The memory clawed at him, a promise he couldn't shake. They'd been inseparable. Ethan with his quiet grit, Sam with his quick laugh, bonded over late-night talks about home, Ethan's tales of Riverton's green hills lighting up the darkest shifts. Now Sam scoured the wreckage, kicking aside debris, his hands trembling as he searched for any sign. Under a toppled cot, he found it, a blood-stained envelope, the corner smudged with Ethan's handwriting. To Grandma Ruth. His throat tightened as he tucked it into his vest, the paper crinkling against his chest. Not enough, he muttered, wiping sweat from his brow. Where are you, Ramsey? Back in Riverton. Late summer draped the town in a golden haze, the air buzzing with cicadas as dusk settled over Ruth Ramsey's farmhouse. The porch creaked under the weight of neighbors and friends, their voices a soft hum as they gathered for a prayer vigil Ruth had organized. Lanterns flickered along the railing, casting a warm glow over faces etched with worry. Mrs. Clara with her silver hair, Pastor James from the Baptist church, young Tommy from the feed store clutching a cap. Ruth stood at the center, her cane steadying her frail frame, her gray sweater draped loosely over her shoulders despite the heat. Her eyes, red-rimmed from sleepless nights, held a fierce resolve as she clutched Ethan's last letter, its edges frayed from endless rereading. "Thank y'all for coming," she said, her voice raspy but firm, cutting through the evening quiet. "My Ethan's missing out there. Been 3 weeks since we got word. But he's a fighter, and I ain't giving up on him." The crowd nodded, murmurs of agreement rippling through. Pastor James stepped forward, his Bible worn from years of sermons. "Let's lift him up," he said, his deep voice steady. "Lord, guide Ethan Ramsey home. Keep him strong, wherever he is." Heads bowed, hands clasped, and Ruth closed her eyes, her lips moving silently. "You promised, Ethan. Come back to me." The prayer rose like a tide, a communal plea against the silence that had swallowed her grandson. In Afghanistan, Sam pressed on, his boots crunching over rubble as he traced the path of the attack. The insurgents had hit fast, RPGs tearing through the base, bullets flying in a chaotic storm. He'd seen Ethan dive for a wounded medic, dragging him to safety before the blast that separated them. Now Sam's search led him to a shallow ditch near the perimeter, where a glint of metal caught his eye. Ethan's dog tags, tangled in a scrap of fabric. His heart lurched, but there was no body, no blood trail, just the tags and a faint hope. "You're out there," he whispered, pocketing them beside the letter. "Gotta be." Flashbacks flickered through his mind. Ethan under a starry desert sky, reading Ruth's replies aloud, his voice softening at her tales of Riverton. "She's turning 90 soon," he'd told Sam one night, his hazel eyes glinting with pride. "Promised I'd be there. Cake and all. Can't let her down." Sam had grinned, tossing a pebble at him. "Better save me a slice, man." Ethan's laugh had echoed, a rare sound in that barren place, and Sam clung to it now, a lifeline driving him forward. He radioed command, his voice hoarse. "Still no sign of Ramsey. Requesting wider sweep, can't stop yet." The crackled reply was grim. "Resources thin, Carter. Wrap it up." But Sam ignored it, turning back to the dunes. In Riverton, the vigil stretched into the night, lanterns swaying as the crowd sang "Amazing Grace," their voices weaving through the trees. Ruth stood apart, leaning on her cane, her gaze fixed on the stars. She'd heard the army's call, missing in action, and felt the town's whispers, their pity cloaking her like a shroud. But she refused to break. "He's alive," she'd told Mrs. Clara earlier, her hands twisting the letter. "I'd know if he wasn't. I'd feel it." Clara had squeezed her shoulder, her voice soft. "Then we keep praying, Ruth. He's got your stubbornness, won't give up easy." The song faded and Pastor James offered a final prayer, his words a balm against the ache in Ruth's chest. "Bring him home, Lord, safe in your hands." The crowd dispersed, leaving hugs and quiet promises. "We're with you, Ruth," as they drifted back to their lives. She lingered on the porch, rusty at her feet, the letter pressed to her heart. 3 months left, she whispered, her breath fogging in the cooling air. "You're out there, Ethan. I know it." In Afghanistan, Sam sank to his knees, the desert stretching silent around him, the letter and tags heavy in his vest. He didn't have Ethan, not yet, but he had proof, a promise written in blood and ink, a vow to Ruth that Sam would carry if Ethan couldn't. The sun dipped low, casting long shadows over the dunes, and Sam vowed silently, "I'll find you, Ramsey, or I'll get this home." The search wasn't over. Not for Ethan, not for the hope Ruth held tight across the ocean. The sterile hum of a military hospital in Southern California filled the air as Private Sam Carter sat on the edge of a cot, his discharge papers crumpled in his hand. Early fall sunlight streamed through the narrow window, glinting off the dog tags around his neck. Ethan Ramsey's tags, salvaged from the Afghan ditch where he'd last seen his friend alive. At 24, Sam looked older now, his freckled face gaunt from weeks of recovery, his blue eyes shadowed by the weight of loss. The ambush had taken half his unit, left him with shrapnel scars across his shoulder, and stolen Ethan, confirmed dead after a grueling search yielded his body miles from the base. Sam clutched the blood-stained letter in his vest. Ethan's final words to Ruth Ramsey scrawled inside. "Tell her I kept my word." He'd failed to bring Ethan home alive, but this. He could do this. Sam hitched his duffel over his good shoulder, the ache in his arm a dull reminder of the blast, and stepped into the parking lot. His beat-up Chevy pickup waited, a relic from his Fresno days, and he tossed the bag into the bed, sliding into the driver's seat with a grunt. The letter rested on the passenger seat, a silent passenger for the 2,000-mile trek to Riverton, Tennessee. "You're getting home, Ramsey," he muttered, turning the key. The engine sputtered to life, and he pulled onto the highway, the endless ribbon of asphalt stretching east, a long road to keep a promise he'd never spoken aloud but felt in his bones. Back in Riverton, October's first chill kissed the air, the farmhouse's fields fading from green to amber as Ruth Ramsey bustled in her kitchen. She wore a faded apron over her sweater, her hands steady despite the tremor that had crept in since Ethan went missing. The calendar on the wall marked her 90th birthday just days away, and she'd circled it in red, a stubborn act of faith even after the Army's call shifted missing to deceased. She hummed Amazing Grace, her voice soft and raspy, as she rolled dough for pecan pies, the recipe Ethan loved. Rusty snoozed by the stove, his snores a quiet counterpoint to her work. She wouldn't let grief steal this day, not yet. Mrs. Clara poked her head in, her silver hair tied back, a basket of apples in her arms. "Need a hand, Ruth?" she asked, setting the fruit on the counter. Ruth smiled, faint but real. "Always room for you, Clara. Gotta keep busy. Ethan'd want that." Clara nodded, peeling an apple with practiced ease. "Town's buzzing about your party. Pastor James is bringing the choir. Tommy's hauling chairs. We're all here for you." Ruth's hands paused, her eyes glistening. "He promised he'd be here, Clara. Cake and all. I can't." She trailed off, swallowing hard. Clara squeezed her arm. "He's with you, Ruth, one way or another." On the road, Sam drove through desert flats and mountain passes, the Chevy's radio crackling with static as he crossed state lines. Nevada, Utah, Colorado. Flashbacks haunted the miles. Ethan under a flickering lamp in their tent, his pen scratching late into the night. "This one's for Grandma," he'd said, his voice steady despite the gunfire echoing outside. "She's turning 90. Promised I'd make it back." Sam had smirked, tossing a boot at him. "Better not leave me out there alone, Ramsey." Ethan's grin had flashed, bright against the gloom. "Never, Carter. Just keep up." Now Sam gripped the wheel, his knuckles white, the memory a knife in his chest. Ethan had written under fire, the letter stained with blood from a wound he'd ignored to finish it. A promise kept in ways Sam was only beginning to understand. By Kansas, the plains stretched wide and golden, the sky bruising purple with dusk. Sam pulled into a gas station, the neon sign buzzing as he filled the tank. He leaned against the truck, pulling the letter from his vest, its edges curling from heat and wear. He unfolded it, his voice low as he read aloud, "Grandma, if this gets to you late, don't worry, I'm still coming. Saved a girl today, named her Ruth for you. Tell her I kept my word." His throat closed, tears blurring the ink. Ethan had died dragging a child from the wreckage, a final act Sam had pieced together from survivors' accounts. He wiped his face, the words searing into him. Ethan's promise wasn't just about cake. It was about courage, about leaving something good behind. In Riverton, Ruth hung lanterns on the porch, her cane tapping as she moved. The town had rallied, neighbors strung lights, kids painted signs, but her heart ached with each step. She'd stopped writing replies after the Army's call, the stack of Ethan's letters her only tether now. "He's gone, Rusty," she whispered to the dog, who nudged her hand with a whine. "But I'll celebrate, for him." She hid her grief behind a brave face, her faith tested but unbroken, trusting Ethan's spirit lingered in the birthday she'd planned. Sam crossed Missouri, then Kentucky, the Chevy rattling as exhaustion gnawed at him. Nightmares jolted him awake at rest stops, explosions, Ethan's shout, the silence after. But the letter kept him going, a beacon through the fog of PTSD. By the Tennessee border, the hills rose familiar and green, a landscape Ethan had painted in words. Sam's hands shook as he gripped the wheel, Riverton's outskirts coming into view. He didn't know Ruth, had never met her, but he carried Ethan's heart in that envelope, a promise he'd deliver no matter the cost. The farmhouse loomed ahead, its porch aglow with lanterns, the hum of voices spilling out as Ruth's birthday eve began. Sam parked, dust settling around the truck, and stepped out, the letter heavy in his hand. He straightened his faded jacket, Ethan's tags clinking against his chest, and took a deep breath. This was it, the end of the road, the start of something else. He climbed the steps, his boots thudding against the wood, and knocked, the sound echoing into the night. Ruth's promise waited inside, and Sam was here to keep it. For Ethan, for her, for the bond that stretched beyond the grave. The farmhouse porch glowed under a canopy of lanterns, their warm light swaying in the crisp October breeze as Riverton, Tennessee, gathered on the eve of Ruth Ramsey's 90th birthday. Voices hummed through the dusk, neighbors chatting, kids giggling, the faint strum of a guitar from Pastor James tuning up for tomorrow's celebration. Inside, Ruth moved through the kitchen, her apron dusted with flour from the pecan pies cooling on the counter, her cane tapping a steady rhythm against the linoleum. She paused by the window, her gray eyes tracing the stars above the hills, a quiet ache settling in her chest. 3 months had passed since Ethan's death was confirmed, and though the town rallied to lift her spirits, the silence of his absence echoed louder tonight. The screen door creaked and Mrs. Clara poked her head in, her silver hair catching the light. "Ruth, you need anything?" Tommy's setting up chairs out back. Ruth forced a smile, her voice raspy but warm. "I'm good, Clara. Just keeping busy. Ethan'd want that." Clara nodded, her eyes soft with understanding, and slipped back outside. Ruth turned to the stack of Ethan's letters on the table, her fingers brushing the red ribbon that bound them. She hadn't touched them since the Army's call, couldn't bear the weight of his words knowing he'd never write again. "Cake and all," she whispered, her breath fogging the glass. "You promised, Ethan." A sharp knock jolted her from her thoughts, the sound cutting through the murmur of the gathering crowd. Rusty barked, his scruffy tail wagging as he trotted to the door. Ruth frowned, wiping her hands on her apron, and shuffled over, her cane steadying her. She opened the door expecting another neighbor with a casserole or a well-wish, but instead found a stranger, tall, wiry, his faded jacket streaked with road dust. Sam Carter stood there, his freckled face pale under the porch light, his blue eyes shadowed with exhaustion. Ethan's dog tags glinted at his neck, and in his hand, he held a crumpled, blood-stained envelope. "Mrs. Ramsey?" Sam's voice was rough, worn from days on the road. Ruth blinked, her heart thudding as she took him in, the military bearing the tags, the letter. "That's me," she said, her tone cautious. "Who are you?" Sam swallowed, his grip tightening on the envelope. "I'm Sam Carter, served with Ethan. He asked me to get this to you." He held out the letter, his hand trembling slightly, and Ruth's breath caught, her eyes locking onto the familiar handwriting. To Grandma Ruth. Her knees buckled and she gripped the door frame, Rusty nudging her leg with a whine. "Come in," she managed, stepping aside, her mind racing as Sam crossed the threshold. The kitchen felt smaller with him there, his presence a bridge to a world she'd lost. She sank into a chair, motioning him to sit, and took the letter with shaking hands. "He's gone," she said. Not a question, her voice breaking as she met Sam's gaze. Sam nodded, his throat bobbing. "Yeah, 3 months back. Ambush. I tried to find him, but..." He trailed off, his eyes dropping to the floor. Ruth unfolded the letter, her fingers tracing the smudged ink, and began to read silently, tears welling as Ethan's voice came alive through the words. "Grandma," it began, "if this gets to you late, don't worry. I'm still coming. Things got rough here, but I kept my word. Saved a girl today, pulled her from the wreckage. Named her Ruth for you. Thought you'd like that. Tell Mrs. Clara I'll fix her fence next time and save me that dance. Love, Ethan." The tears spilled now, streaking down her weathered cheeks, soaking the paper as she pressed it to her chest. Sam leaned forward, his voice low. He wrote that under fire. Wouldn't stop till it was done. Last thing he did was save that kid. Called her Little Ruth right before. He choked, wiping his face with his sleeve. Ruth's sob broke the silence, a raw, choked sound that filled the room. "He came home after all," she whispered, her voice trembling with a mix of grief and pride. She looked at Sam, her eyes glistening. "You were with him?" Sam nodded, pulling Ethan's tags from his neck and setting them on the table. "Till the end. He dragged that medic out, then went back for the girl. Didn't hesitate. I found this after with his tags. Took me 3 months to get here. Had to bring it myself." Ruth reached for the tags, her fingers closing around the metal, still warm from Sam's skin. "My boy," she murmured, clutching them tight. The kitchen door creaked and Mrs. Clara stepped in, freezing at the sight. "Ruth? Everything okay?" Ruth looked up, her face wet but her voice steadying. "Clara, this is Sam, Ethan's friend. He brought me his last letter." Clara's eyes widened, softening as she crossed to Ruth's side, resting a hand on her shoulder. "Oh, honey," she whispered, glancing at Sam with gratitude. Ruth handed her the letter, and Clara read it silently, tears brimming as she reached Ethan's final lines. "He kept his promise," Clara said, her voice thick. "In his own way." Sam shifted, his hands fidgeting. "He talked about you all the time, Mrs. Ramsey. Your stories, this place, kept him going out there. I couldn't let him down." Ruth met his gaze, her eyes fierce despite the tears. "You didn't, Sam. You brought him to me, right when I needed him most." She rose, leaning on her cane, and pulled Sam into a hug, her frail arms strong with a grandmother's love. He stiffened, then relaxed, his own tears falling as he hugged her back, the weight of the road lifting just a little. Outside, the lanterns swayed, the crowds hum a distant chorus as Ruth held the letter and tags, Ethan's presence filling the kitchen. Tomorrow was her birthday, and though he wouldn't be there with cake, he'd kept his word. In a child named Ruth, in a letter carried across the world, in a friend who'd walked through fire to deliver it. She wiped her eyes, a bittersweet peace settling in. "Thank you, Sam," she said, her voice firm. "You're staying. Family now." Sam nodded, a faint smile breaking through, and in that moment, Ethan's promise lived on, binding them all. The farmhouse backyard in Riverton, Tennessee, buzzed with life under a crisp October sky. The late afternoon sun casting a golden glow over Ruth Ramsey's 90th birthday celebration. Lanterns swayed from the oak trees, their warm light mingling with strings of bulbs Tommy from the feed store had strung up, turning the field into a patchwork of color and cheer. Long tables groaned under platters of pecan pies, fried chicken and cornbread, the air thick with the scent of barbecue and sweet tea. Pastor James led the church choir in a soulful rendition of "This Little Light of Mine," their voices rising above the chatter of neighbors, kids darting between legs, and Rusty barking at the excitement. Ruth stood at the heart of it all, her cane steady in the grass, her gray sweater swapped for a floral dress Clara had insisted she wear. "For Ethan," she'd said. Ruth's eyes, still red-rimmed from last night's tears, shone with a quiet strength as she surveyed the crowd. The town had turned out in force, Mrs. Clara bustling with a tray of biscuits, young Tommy hauling chairs, families from church and the market filling the yard with laughter and stories. Beside her stood Private Sam Carter, his faded jacket swapped for a borrowed button-up, his freckled face flushed from the warmth of the welcome. He'd arrived with Ethan's final letter just hours ago, and Ruth had declared him family on the spot, his presence a tether to the grandson she'd lost. Now, he shifted awkwardly, his hands in his pockets, Ethan's dog tags glinting at his neck as neighbors clapped his shoulder and thanked him for his service. "Never seen so many folks in one place," Sam murmured, his voice low as he leaned toward Ruth. She chuckled, raspy but genuine. "Riverton don't mess around for birthdays, especially not mine. Ethan'd love this." She patted his arm, her touch firm despite her frail hands, and Sam nodded, a faint smile breaking through his guarded expression. The choir finished, and Pastor James stepped forward, his Bible tucked under his arm, his deep voice carrying over the crowd. "We're here to honor Ruth Ramsey, 90 years of grace and grit, but tonight's more than that. It's about a promise kept, a light that don't go out." Ruth took a deep breath, her cane sinking into the soft earth as she stepped up beside him, Ethan's letter trembling in her hand. The crowd hushed, faces turning toward her, old friends, young families, kids clutching balloons. "Y'all know my Ethan," she began, her voice steady despite the crack in it. "He promised he'd be here, cake and all. 3 months back he went missing and I thought I'd lost him for good." She paused, her eyes glistening, and Sam shifted closer, a silent anchor. "Last night Sam here brought me his final letter, wrote it under fire with his last breath, and I want to share it with you." She unfolded the paper, its edges worn and stained, and read aloud, her raspy voice carrying Ethan's words across the yard. "Grandma, If this gets to you late, don't worry, I'm still coming. Saved a girl today. Pulled her from the wreckage. Named her Ruth for you. Thought you'd like that. Tell Mrs. Clara I'll fix her fence next time and save me that dance. Love, Ethan. Tears streaked her cheeks. But she kept going, her voice rising with pride. He didn't make it home, but he kept his word. Saved a life, gave her my name, that's my boy. The crowd murmured, some wiping eyes, others nodding, Ethan's courage settling over them like a shared heartbeat. Clara stepped forward, her silver hair glinting as she hugged Ruth tight. He's here, Ruth, in every word, every one of us. Ruth nodded, pressing the letter to her chest, and turned to Sam. Tell him the rest, she said, her voice soft but firm. Sam cleared his throat, his hands fidgeting as he faced the crowd. Ethan was my best friend out there, he said, his voice rough but steady. Last thing he did was drag that girl out. Called her Little Ruth before he went down. I found this letter after with his tags. Drove 2,000 miles to get it here. He'd want you to know he didn't quit. A ripple of gasps and soft applause spread through the yard, and Sam pulled a photo from his pocket, a grainy shot of a small Afghan girl, her dark eyes wide, sent by a surviving squad mate. This is her, he said, holding it up. Little Ruth, living proof he kept his promise. Ruth took the photo, her fingers trembling as she traced the girl's face, a sob catching in her throat. My Ethan, she whispered, and the crowd surged closer, their voices lifting in a chorus of support. God bless him. He's a hero. Pastor James raised his hands, quieting the din. This ain't just Ruth's day. It's Ethan's too. Let's light these candles for them both. Tommy rolled out a massive cake. Chocolate with pecans, Ethan's favorite. Its 90 candles flickering as the choir struck up Happy Birthday. Ruth leaned on Sam, her hand steadying against his arm, and together they blew out the flames, the crowd erupting in cheers. She closed her eyes, whispering, For you, Ethan, as the glow reflected in her tears, a bittersweet joy that filled the night. The party unfolded in a blur of song and stories. Kids chasing fireflies, neighbors sharing tales of Ethan's high school pranks, Sam laughing for the first time in months as Clara roped him into a square dance. Ruth sat at the table's head, the letter and tags beside her, a quiet peace settling in her bones. She watched Sam, his awkward grin as he twirled with Clara, and saw Ethan in him, a piece of her boy carried home. The celebration wasn't what she'd dreamed. No dance with Ethan, no cake sliced together. But it was more, a tribute to his life, his promise, his light that burned on in a girl halfway across the world, and a town that held him close. As the stars thickened overhead, Ruth leaned back, her cane resting against her chair, and smiled. A real one, small but true. Ethan hadn't made it with cake, but he'd come home in Sam's hands, in little Ruth's name, in the love that surrounded her now. The birthday light glowed bright, a beacon through the grief, and she knew he was there. Always would be. The morning sun crept over the hills of Riverton, Tennessee, its soft light filtering through the farmhouse's cracked window to paint the porch in shades of gold. Ruth Ramsey sat in her rocking chair, a steaming mug of tea cradled in her hands, the faint chill of late October brushing her cheeks. The echoes of her 90th birthday celebration lingered, the laughter, the choir's hymns, the glow of 90 candles. But the yard was quiet now, the lanterns dimmed, the tables cleared. Rusty snoozed at her feet, his scruffy tail twitching in a dream, and beside her, Private Sam Carter leaned against the railing, his faded jacket back on, Ethan's dog tags glinting at his neck. The stillness felt different today, not heavy with loss but steady, like a breath after a long storm. Ruth sipped her tea, her gray eyes tracing the fields where Ethan had once run, his lanky frame darting through the grass with a football or a kite. Last night had shifted something in her, the final letter Sam delivered, Ethan's words of saving little Ruth. The town's embrace turning her grief into pride. She glanced at Sam, his freckled face softer in the morning light, the exhaustion of his 2,000-mile trek giving way to a quiet resolve. You sleep okay? She asked, her voice raspy but warm. Sam nodded, a faint smile tugging at his lips. Better than I have in months, Mrs. Ramsey. That bed's a sight comfier than a cot in the desert. She chuckled, the sound creaking like the chair beneath her. Call me Ruth, Sam. You're family now. Ethan'd want that. Sam's smile deepened, his hand brushing the tags. He talked about this place all the time, said it kept him grounded out there. I get it now. Ruth's eyes glistened, but she held his gaze. And you brought him back to me, more than I dared hope. That letter, those tags, it's like he's still here, sittin' right where you are. Sam looked down, his throat bobbing, and nodded. I couldn't save him, Ruth, but I couldn't let him down either. Ruth set her mug on the porch table, reaching into her sweater pocket to pull out a folded envelope. Her own letter, written weeks ago when Ethan was still missing, never sent. Been meaning to give you this, she said, handing it to him. Sam took it, his brow furrowing as he unfolded the paper, her wobbly handwriting spilling across the page. Dear Ethan, your letters stopped, but I ain't stopped believing. You're my rock, always have been. Kept me going when I lost your grandpa, your folks. Come home, baby. I'm waiting with cake and all. Love, Grandma. His voice caught as he read aloud, and Ruth's hand rested on his arm, steady despite its tremble. You were his rock too, Sam, she said, her tone firm. He leaned on you out there. I see it in how you carried this through. Don't you forget that. Sam wiped his eyes, folding the letter carefully. I'll keep it, if that's okay. Reminds me why I made it here. Ruth nodded, a tear slipping free. It's yours now. Ethan'd like that. They sat in silence, the cricket's morning song weaving through the air, a shared understanding settling between them. Two souls tethered by a promise that stretched beyond words. Later, Ruth led Sam to the backyard, a spade in her hand and a small rose bush tucked under her arm. The birthday crowd had left a patch of cleared earth near the oak tree, and she pointed to it, her cane sinking into the grass. Thought we'd plant this. For Ethan, she said. He loved roses, used to pick 'em wild for me when he was little. Sam took the spade, digging a hole with steady hands, the rhythm calming the tremor in his chest. Ruth knelt beside him, her knees creaking, and unwound Ethan's dog tags from Sam's neck, draping them over the bush's roots before they covered it with soil. A marker, she murmured. So he's always home. Sam patted the earth flat, the rose bush standing small but strong, its buds a promise of blooms to come. Looks right, he said, his voice thick. Ruth smiled, a real one that crinkled her eyes. It does, and you're staying, Sam. Riverton's got room for you. Mrs. Clara's fence needs fixin', and I could use the company. Sam hesitated, his gaze drifting to the hills, then back to her. I don't know where else I'd go, he admitted. Lost too much out there. Ethan, the others. Maybe here's where I find something again. Ruth squeezed his hand, her grip fierce. You already have. They stood, the rosebush a quiet tribute between them, and Ruth's thoughts drifted to little Ruth, the Afghan girl Ethan had saved, a piece of him living on across the world. She'd never meet her, but the name bound them, a legacy she'd carry with pride. He's still with us, she said, her voice steady now. In every letter, every story, every bloom that'll grow here. Sam nodded, his eyes bright with unshed tears. Yeah, he is. The day unfolded gently, Sam hauling wood with Tommy, Clara roping him into kitchen duty, the town folding him into its rhythm like he'd always belonged. Ruth watched from the porch, her cane at her side, a peace settling deep in her bones. Ethan hadn't come home as she'd dreamed, no dance, no cake sliced together, but he'd returned in Sam's hands, in a child's name, in a rose bush rooted in Riverton soil. His promise lived beyond the words, a light that warmed her through the grief. As dusk fell, Ruth rocked slowly, Rusty at her feet, the stars thickening overhead. She closed her eyes, Ethan's grin flashing in her mind, and whispered, You kept your word, baby. The rosebush swayed in the breeze, a living echo of his love, and she knew, here, with Sam, with Riverton, with every memory, they'd carry him forward, together, beyond the storm. Under the clear blue sky of Riverton, Tennessee, the autumn sunlight cast a golden glow on the small rosebush by the oak tree, where Ethan Ramsey's dog tag swayed gently in the breeze. Ruth Ramsey stood on the porch, leaning on her cane, her gray eyes glistening as she watched Sam Carter laugh with the children in the yard. He had found a home here, among those who were once strangers. Ethan's final letter, now resting on the kitchen table beside a photograph of little Ruth, was more than a goodbye. It was a flame he left behind, burning bright across oceans, through grief, and beyond time. Ruth smiled, feeling him in every gust of wind, in every budding rose, knowing that his love and courage lived on, never fading. This is not the end, but proof that even in loss, we can plant the seeds of hope, rebuild from the ashes, and find light in the dark. Ethan kept his promise in his own way, and Ruth, alongside Sam, carries that flame forward, a legacy of strength and connection for us all. If this story touched you, if you believe in flames that never die, hit the subscribe button below. Together we'll continue telling stories that inspire, illuminating the world one word at a time.